Some say that history always repeats. Following the news and hearing the same story day in, day out would give that impression. I witnessed an exciting new story recently, but the news managed to turn it into that old one about the Nazis again. Nazis in the sheepfold, wolves in hippies' clothing, leading the poor fools astray. I used to waste a lot of energy trying to tear down old stories. But a lot of people really like upholding that story, so I learned that attacking the old is much less effective than building a new story on the lawn. Building it as good and beautiful as can be and loving it while it lasts. Then mourning it when it gets squashed, preparing to rebuild another new story. The first thing a good story needs is a deeply rooted truth. And I like to imagine that the owner of that yurt was looking at the same deep truth that caught my eye. That lion is awake. Some might doubt the depth of truth of that statement, but bear with me through some context. Here we can see some lions that are not awake. Look, that one even let someone put a chain over its back feet. This provincial hometown cenotaph lion looks pretty awake. But if we compare its posture to the capital city cenotaph lion, look at that kitty having a stretch. We can see that the Wellington lion here, uniquely, has been cast in the process of waking up. This looks like the lions are awakening, and I'm taking that as a truth deep enough to support a good story. Let's take a moment to acknowledge that lions are terrifying. There's a thread of tradition that casts the lion as a portion of the self, by extension, also a portion of the community. Some might see in these images an aspiration to overpower that beastly portion, either by physical force or by willpower. If you can look into the face of the desire for separation and suppression, you might see that this is actually a choose-your-own-adventure story. Having desires that are rooted in fear is not bad or wrong, but it's a universal truth that the path of fear and separation only leads to more fear and more separation. What if we keep the lion as a portion of self and of community, but follow it along the path of love and integration, where we'll hope to find more love and more integration? Also, Nietzsche's character Zarathustra is on this path, and he tells a story that casts the lion as the middle of 3 stages. The journey of the self starts with the camel, heavily laden with other people's ideas, setting off into the desert. At the transitional moment, the self desires to cast off those old ideas, and, as a lion, to proclaim its own I will. But the lion's path is blocked by the incumbent lord of the desert, who is the dragon Thou Shalt, each of his shiny scales gleaming with 1,000 years of Thou Shalts. Many selves are so impressed by this dragon that they continue to submit to Thou Shalts for their entire lives. But Zarathustra's lion proclaims a sacred no that denies the dragon power over it. Then, in the final stage, the self transforms again from a lion into a child, the only creature capable of proclaiming a sacred yes in the space that's left by the absence of the dragon's control. Now, I think it would be wise to resist temptation to cast the New Zealand government or any individual figures within it in the role of the dragon of Thou Shalt in Nietzsche's tale, because some people have a certain sensitivity to references to reptile-type creatures in government. Also, at the risk of stating the obvious, the dragon is imaginary. The process of asserting I will and negating the power of Thou Shalt over our lives is also an internal battle, and generally one that the protesters went through before they got in their cars and drove to Wellington. Dragon references, locally speaking, are also just plain inaccurate. When you gaze upon the face of our Prime Minister, what sacred beast do you picture? Be honest. Now, what kind of a horse has only one issue on its mind? It's a pointy, jabby sort of issue that leaves no space for any sort of balance in public health policy or in governance at all? By some historical fold in space-time that isn't necessarily magical, there is a unicorn in the background of this image, standing opposite the lion as they together hold up the British coat of arms. I could not make this stuff up. We're here, we've cast off our camel baggage, we asserted ourselves against the dragon of thou shalt, but on our way to becoming a child and embodying those sacred yeses that are already starting to reverberate around, we've apparently been distracted by a showdown with this unicorn. When I saw this part of the story coming, I was pleased to note that it's been prophesied that the lion wins, because the lion represents England in partnership with Scotland. And perhaps the reason the unicorn is wearing a collar and a chain is to demonstrate how unequal this partnership is. There are no visible chains on the lion, so it's harder to imagine why that wild beast is standing around on two legs, holding up the British coat of arms. It's all very unnatural. Looking at this poor chained unicorn, who clearly can't help her actions, was already making me a whole lot less enthusiastic about being on the winning team of lion. Then I found out that in the rest of the nursery rhyme, it's been prophesied that after the lion has beat the unicorn out, he beat him in again, and then he beat him 3 times over, his power to maintain. I was starting to realize that these creatures are trapped in a cycle of violence. And that's around about when the riot police came. Just like every day, that day was a choose-your-own-adventure story. And in due course, the adventure that I chose was to go in the bush and pray. As I was thinking about invoking the field of peace over Wellington, that it might spiral outwards even to the Ukraine, I had a meaningful encounter with a stag. The first thing he did was to lend me an ideal symbol. A stag is a powerful and assertive creature who is nevertheless non-violent. He can be a dangerous animal, but as a herbivore, he's not motivated to draw blood. The stag enters this story in the role of mediator because of a Buddhist tale that casts the stag as a negotiator who speaks on behalf of all animals. The human king enjoys hunting and has imprisoned 2 herds of deer in an enclosure, unaware that one of the 2 stags is an incarnation of the Buddha himself. When the Buddha, as a stag, offers his life in place of the 2 lives of a pregnant doe and her fawn, the human king is so moved that he offers the Buddha's entire herd their freedom. But the Buddha refuses on account of his compassion for the other imprisoned herd. If his people are allowed to go free, their suffering will only be intensified. As the stag negotiates, the human king extends his offer of freedom first to all the deer, then all the 4-footed animals, then to include the birds, and finally even the fish, as the Buddha explains that he can only be free if all his brothers are also free. A negotiator of miraculous ability is clearly what the lion and the unicorn are in need of after all these centuries. So I asked the stag if he would be willing to step in. He looks at the cycle of violence that has trapped these 2 creatures, and he speaks first to the lion. Remember that you are already free, says the stag. The only thing that can bind you is the desire for that crown on your head. You can choose to walk away from this situation. As the lion's front paws hit the ground, the unicorn seems poised to spring for the crown as it falls, but the coat of arms trembles and she grips it more tightly with her forelegs. The stag turns away from the lion and addresses the unicorn. "My love," he says, "do you remember when we were married?" The unicorn's gaze remains fixed on the fallen crown, and for a moment she appears not to have heard the stag. "Do I... married?" she says, glancing briefly towards the stag and then back to the crown, as her mind scans through a sea of images of children's toys and Scottish independence referendums. "Married, my love," says the stag. And the unicorn turns her head to look at him properly for the first time. "We are the union of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. Do you remember when we lived in the forest that is the body of the world? And none could stand against us because we stood together." The unicorn shivers. She tosses her head once as if to see whether the memory can be shaken out. Her collar rattles and she starts backwards at the sound, coming down on her 4 hooves with a metallic crash. She has remembered being free and living in the forest that is the body of the world, being part of the union of the divine feminine with the divine masculine who has finally come back to her. As the coat of arms starts to sway, the stag says, "Come, my love. Let me help you out of that collar."